have yet another distinguished UCI professor with us this evening. Charis Kubrin is professor of criminology, law, and society. She's a published author of books and articles, including last year's, quote, New Directions in Research on Immigration, Crime, Law, and Justice, and is here tonight to answer the question, immigration and crime, is the narrative fact or fiction? Last year, according to a Pew survey, most U.S. adults think undocumented immigrants are no more likely than U.S. citizens to commit serious crimes. But a strong minority disagrees. Those who disagree are most likely to be over 65 and conservative. And I hope that isn't any of you. Please welcome Professor Charis Kubrin.
Have you ever had a series of life events rock your world so profoundly that they fundamentally challenged and ultimately reshaped your old way of thinking? Well, the beginning of my paradigm shift started back in 2006. I was an assistant professor of sociology at George Washington University, living in Washington, D.C., trying to climb my way up the tenure ladder. And it was a Saturday or a Sunday, one weekend day. I was in my pajamas and I was online reading newspapers. And I came across an op-ed written by a famous criminologist, someone who was a personal hero to me, a guy by the name of Robert Samson. And the title of the op-ed, Open Doors Don't Invite Criminals, intrigued me. So I read it. And what Rob Samson was arguing in this op-ed was that criminologists had been getting it wrong in terms of their explanations for the crime drop. So you may or may not know, but that crime rates went down in cities all across the United States in the 90s and early 2000s. And the typical reasons that criminologists had been giving for this crime drop, things like the strong economy of the 90s or the recession of the crack market or incarceration, he said, didn't really fully tell the story. He said there was another factor that was responsible for crime rates, something that we had overlooked largely because of an inherent bias that we as academics and the public had. And I thought, I wonder what he's talking about. Turns out he was talking about immigration. Rob Samson's argument was that immigration to cities went up at the same time that crime rates in the United States went down, that they were in fact related. And he based his argument on a study that he had done in the city of Chicago, where he conducted a survey, and he found in his survey that foreign-born individuals reported lower rates of crime and victimization than their native-born counterparts. And he also found that regardless of whether you were foreign-born or native-born living in the city of Chicago, if you lived in a neighborhood that had a high concentration of immigrants, you had very low rates of crime and victimization. And he published those findings in a journal called the American Journal of Public Health. Now, he supplemented that argument for Chicago using national data showing homicide trends and immigration in the United States over time. So you can see, just as immigration is going up, homicides are going down. Well, I was fascinated by this op-ed. I got right on emailed him, and I asked him to send me a copy of the paper. And he must have been right online, because he got right back to me, sent me the paper, and then he said, thank you. Yours is the only friendly email I have received all day. And I said, well, what do you mean? And then he started forwarding me all of the hate mail that he had been receiving all morning long, including this one. Dear Professor Samson, I met your article with not merely a chuckle, but guffaws, uncontrollable hysterical laughter. On what planet did you study sociology, Buck Rogers' Mongo? I have never read a collection of convoluted statistics and fabricated claptraps such as you espouse, not in my 65 years, that even began to approach the level of absurdity you puff. I don't know from where you get your alleged facts, but I lived with your precious Mexican Americans in Phoenix, Arizona. I regularly witnessed drunken brawls, defecation in public streets, destruction of public property, violent fights with knives, guns, and machetes, assaults on innocents, a level of burglary and theft never before seen until Mexicans moved into the area. 6 or 8 decades ago, before criminal indigent Mexicans began to fill our cities and towns, immigrants were studious, energetic, eager to assimilate, and peaceful. They contributed to this nation. Today's immigrants, however, especially Mexicans, are generally lazy, criminal, have no intention of assimilating, are uneducated beyond perhaps mid-grade school, have no trade, and are here for what they can suck from the lifeblood of our country. You and your Ivy League educated ilk live in a counterfeit utopian sphere of fantasy and lunacy. Your hot air would fill all of the balloons at the New Mexico Balloon Fest, leaving enough to launch the next space shuttle. Well, I received this email and I was blown away. I mean, I was angry, I was livid. And I read all of the emails that he received and I felt the same way. I mean, I was so taken aback, not just by the fact that they couldn't accept what the findings showed, but the nastiness of the comments. I mean, this is work being done by a premier sociologist, the president of the American Society of Criminology. He was chair at Harvard, one of the most respected criminologists. The data were speaking for themselves. It just seemed that nobody wanted to listen. And this got especially problematic when I got right back online and started looking to see what we know about research on immigration and crime historically. Turns out we have studies dating all the way back to the 1930s, which show that the foreign-born are less crime-prone than the native-born. In fact, I came across a review piece published by the National Institute of Justice that reviewed the research up until that time, and the finding was that the major finding of a century of research on immigration and crime is that immigrants, contrary to popular opinion, nearly always exhibit lower crime rates than native groups. What shocked me was, though, that couldn't have been further from the truth in terms of what public perception was on immigration and crime. I also started looking in the literature to see what we know about public perception on immigration. Research shows no matter which immigrant group we're talking about, no matter which historical time period, public perception is that immigration and crime go hand in hand. And I thought, well, certainly this can't be true today in 2006 in our multicultural and diverse society. But just to be sure, I went and I downloaded data from the latest General Social Survey. And General Social Survey is a survey that's done every 4 years. It's a national survey asking Americans their perceptions on a variety of issues, their thoughts and feelings about a variety of issues. Turns out in 2006, they had a question around immigration. And that question was, does more immigrants coming to this country cause higher crime rates? I downloaded the data, I did a quick frequency distribution, found that 25% of respondents in this national survey said this was very likely, and another 47% said this was somewhat likely, resulting in 3/4 of Americans believing that immigration and crime go hand in hand. Well, that day, just a couple hours later, the results of my investigation fired me up. I got very concerned about how off public perception was with respect to what we know about immigration and crime. And I started wondering whether this faulty perception was responsible for increasingly punitive criminal justice policies aimed at immigrants, things like SB 1070, which was popular in Arizona at the time. And for those of you who may not remember, SB 1070 required law enforcement to question people about their status to determine who might be here in an undocumented status to begin deportation proceedings. Well, I decided right then and there I wanted to get involved in this research, and I was going to be an advocate. And not an advocate in the traditional sense of the word, but really an advocate to use social science research to inform policy. In this case, policy around immigration and crime and justice. And like any good academic, I devised a plan. And step one of my plan involved actually wanting to address some of the limitations of Rob Samson's research. I mean, he got a lot of crazy hate mail, but there were also some fair limitations to his research. And one of those limitations was that his study was centered in Chicago. And of interest would be, could we replicate the findings that he found for Chicago for cities all throughout the United States that had very different demographic and immigration profiles? The second thing that I thought was problematic or weak about his research was that he argued that immigration was responsible in part for the crime drop, and he really only showed us two trends juxtaposed upon each other. We all know, professors love this saying, right, that suggests correlation between the two, but it does not show causation. So I wanted to do a better test of that argument, a better causal test of that argument. So I found some really smart folks to work with, got going on doing analyses, and began writing papers on this topic. Now, the first paper that I wrote, published in Sociological Quarterly, questioned or examined whether Samson's findings for Chicago could be generalizable to the whole US. What we did is we looked at the impact of immigrants in communities on adolescent violence for cities all throughout the United States using a national survey called Adolescent Health. What did we find? The main finding of this study is that immigrant concentration in a community reduces adolescent violence. Youth that reside in neighborhoods with large numbers of foreign-born and non-English speaking residents report fewer acts of violence, okay? Holding all other factors consistent with Samson's findings. To address the second issue, I published another paper in the journal Social Problems with my colleague Graham Owsey at William & Mary. What we wanted to do was do a better causal test of whether immigration impacted crime during the crime drop. So in this study, what we did is we looked at changes in immigration and how they related to changes in crime in 159 cities over a 20-year period. What was our conclusion? First, unlike the long-held popular view that immigration is a major factor contributing to higher crime rates, our results suggest the opposite. On average, cities that experienced increases in immigration during this time period experienced a decrease in violent crime rates. Now, since these two studies, I have gone on to publish over a dozen studies on this topic. And I tell you that because what is absolutely astonishing to me is the consistency of the findings. Like, I guarantee there will not be another professor that gets up here and says, the findings are this consistent. Usually what we like to do is say, some studies found this, other studies found this, we need to do more research. And now, if you don't want to hang your hat on one person's research, on my research, and I suggest you don't, you just need to look at the growing body of scholarship that's been done on immigration and crime. A couple of years ago, I traveled to Washington, D.C. to present findings for a report that I prepared for the National Academy of Sciences. Basically, I was in my office one day at UCI, phone rings, someone from the National Academies of Sciences, that doesn't happen very often, and they said, we want you to prepare a report on every single thing that is known about immigration and crime. And then we want you to come to DC and tell us that. And I said, okay, great, I'll do it. And I then spent the next 5-6 months literally reading and rereading every single study, including that one dating back to 1930 that I mentioned earlier, to figure out what we know about immigration and crime. And this took a lot of time, but it was absolutely rewarding. And I prepared my report and I went to DC, and the big finding here should not be surprising in light of what I've been saying, but this is right out of my report. The consistency with which studies find that areas with greater concentrations of immigrants have lower rates of crime is simply stunning. This finding, according to the collective literature, holds true for various measures of immigrant concentration, as well as for different types of crime, in cross-sectional as well as longitudinal analyses of the immigration crime nexus. And they folded my findings into their final report. This is very deceiving because if you were to be able to flip this, you would see this report that they prepared is about this thick, published by the National Academies Press, titled The Integration of Immigrants into American Society. It's free to download on NAS website. It really is the authoritative piece of work on all aspects of integration of immigrants into American society, marriage, the labor force. It's a really great resource. So a couple weeks after I did this, I was at my annual meeting of the American Society of Criminology. I'd spent all day in panels. I was exhausted. I was having a couple of beers with a colleague of mine who I had written with on immigration before. And I was kind of bragging about my NAS report. I had put a lot of time into it and said I felt really confident about my findings. And he asked me point blank if I thought that my narrative review of the literature would hold up to increased scrutiny. And by increased scrutiny, he meant a quantitative assessment of the literature in this area, and otherwise known as a meta-analysis, which is like the gold standard of review in the field. And at first I got very defensive, like, will it hold up? Of course, I did the hard work. I know what I'm doing, right? And then I thought to myself, is he challenging me? You know, and by then I was like 2 or 3 beers in, so I said, let's do it. And then, of course, I woke up the next morning going, oh my gosh, what did I just agree to do? Because meta-analyses are a ton of work. But we began the long process of identifying, collecting, reading and coding every single study that had been published in a peer-reviewed journal on immigration and crime over a 20-year period, starting in 1994 to 2014. Turns out there were over 50 of these studies, and they collectively produced 550 findings. It took us years to read and code all of this. And basically, we were looking to code things like, how did they measure immigration? What crimes did they examine? What years of data did they use? How many control variables they had? And so on and so forth. About 150 variables per study. All to answer two very simple but important questions. First, across this body of research, what is the overall average immigration-crime relationship? Is it a positive one? More immigration leads to more crime. Is it negative? More immigration leads to less crime. Is it a strong relationship or a weak one? Secondly, if we find any differences across studies in the findings, what accounts for that variation? What study characteristics matter in explaining that variation? Well, after years of collecting the data, we crunched the numbers. And in terms of the first question, what we found, supporting my narrative review of the literature, which I never let Graham live down, is that across this body of literature, on average, the relationship between immigration and crime is weak. In fact, it's most commonly null. There is no relationship between immigration and crime. Increases in immigration have no impact on crime. Decreases there's really no real strong impact. However, when the relationship is significant, it is 2.5 times more likely to be negative. More immigration leads to less crime than positive. Secondly, we found, and this was really, to me, the most interesting finding of the study, the most strongly negative immigration-crime relationship occurred in studies that were what we felt the most rigorous in nature. For example, they had the most control variables, or they used longitudinal data, which allowed them to tease out questions of causality. And Graham and I recently published this paper in an inaugural issue of a new journal called the Annual Review of Criminology, and it turns out that this journal is being edited by none other than Rob Samson, the guy who wrote the op-ed that I started my talk off with. Now, for some people, it's simply unfathomable that more immigration can lead to less crime and that immigrants are less crime-prone than the native-born. But in fact, we have really good social theory to help explain this. So one example of social theory that helps explain this is the very simple fact that immigrants do not represent a random cross-section of people coming from other countries to the US, right? They're not randomly coming here. Individuals that are coming to the United States are usually a highly self-selected group of very motivated individuals who are coming here because they want a better life for themselves and their family. This means they're hardworking, they're motivated, they're willing to delay gratification, right? These are not the characteristics of people that engage in crime. We also know that immigrants, on average, compared to native-born blacks and whites, have higher rates of employment. Now, a lot of this employment is low-wage labor, but it helps offset poverty, and poverty is a correlate of crime. And finally, we also know on average that immigrants are much less likely to have high rates of what we call family disruption, things like divorce and single-parent households. I mean, there's always exceptions, but I'm talking about on average here. And family disruption, too, is a correlate of crime. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, where does the distinction between documented and undocumented immigration fit in all of this? Well, it just so turns out that recently a study was published in the lead journal in my field, Criminology, that asked the question, does undocumented immigration increase violent crime? I've read this study many times, backwards, forwards, inside out. It's a great study. What the authors in this study do is they create 3 different estimates of the unauthorized population in the United States by state. Okay? We don't actually know how many undocumented individuals are here, so we have to create estimates. They use 3 different estimates to look at the relationship between undocumented individuals in states and violent crime rates in states across all of the states from 1990 to 2014. What did they find? No relationship between unauthorized population and crime during this time period. Okay, I could go on and on with the literature, but that brings me to step 2 of my plan. Remember I had this plan that I was going to do? Evidence in hand, I wanted to educate others, particularly our UC Irvine students, right? Our future policymakers, our future leaders. I wanted them to know about what the literature has to say on these topics. So what I did was I created a course at UCI called Immigration and Crime in the Global Context. First course of its kind at UCI and anywhere else as far as I'm aware. The course was meant to expose students to the most up-to-date and best research on what we know about immigration and crime. And it covered a number of different topics: immigrants as victims, immigration and crime control, public discourse, public perception, human rights issues, you've named it. Among the many goals I had for the course, things like becoming a creative thinker and writer, I wanted students to be able to really tease out the rhetoric around this topic and be able to understand how it was becoming politicized and treated in the news media, which I had no idea when I created this course 10 years ago that this was going to be so relevant as it has been today. Now, I teach this class every year at UCI. I just taught it last quarter. It was an intense class, let me tell you. But the students love it, and I love it, and it fills to capacity every single time. So that's been very important to me. Now, my plan didn't stop there, though. Knowing that immigrants are less crime-prone than their native born, and that immigration to an area causes crime to go down rather than up, led me to feel frustrated and outraged about the policies that were being aimed at immigrants, the increasingly punitive policies that were being aimed at immigrants. So, for example, it's the case now that it's harder than ever to gain legal status through the proper channels. I'll often hear people say, well, you just have to do it the right way. That's an unrealistic expectation for many individuals. It's inefficient and it's very costly. It's also the case that we are deporting more people now than we ever have before. And by the way, that started even earlier than now. This was true under the Obama administration. Sorry, Barack. I see you standing there. But it turns out that during Barack Obama's presidency, we were referred to as the deportation nation. And Obama himself was referred to often as the deporter in chief. So this really crosses party lines in many ways. There's also been a movement to criminalize legal status in this country. So primarily, historically, being undocumented was treated like a civil offense. With bills like SB 1070 and copycat laws in places like Georgia and South Carolina, what we are doing is moving to criminalize undocumented status. And then, of course, there's the movements of police officers at the local level policing immigration in new and complex ways. So what we see is what I call the devolution of immigration enforcement. Historically, policing immigration was done at the federal level. We're pushing it down to the lower levels through things like 287G, the Criminal Alien Program, Secure Communities programs. And then, of course, there are all the recent executive orders put forth by Donald Trump, which take aim at immigrants, and I'm sure you're all familiar with those. I started to get very frustrated about these policies in light of what we know about immigration. And so I decided I wanted to redirect my research away from the immigration crime question and onto what the impact of these policies are in terms of how they impact immigrants, immigrant families, and immigrant children. So what I did was I found folks doing great work in this area. We got funding from the National Science Foundation to hold a 2-day workshop where we brought together economists, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, political scientists, all of whom were doing great work in this area. We held this fantastic workshop where folks presented their research. And one of the outcomes of this workshop was our edited volume titled Punishing Immigrants: Policy, Politics, and Injustice. And what we wanted to do in Punishing Immigrants was 3 things. So first, we wanted to uncover and identify the unanticipated and hidden consequences of immigration policies and practices here and abroad. So for example, we asked questions such as, when a workplace raid happens and we deport an individual or begin processing to deport an individual, what impact does that have on those who are left behind, say the spouse and in particular the children? What are the short-term consequences of that and the longer-term consequences of that? We're already seeing with the family separation policies, we're seeing that in real time right now. But these are some of the kinds of things that we focused on here. We also wanted to illuminate the layered realities of immigrants' lives and describe the complexities surrounding immigration and crime law and victimization. As I've been talking about immigration here tonight, I realize that I'm lumping all immigrants together, right? I'm making assumptions about the fact that they're just one big homogenous group. We know how diverse immigrants are on a number of dimensions: race, ethnicity, culture, sending country, reason to migrate to the United States, all of those sorts of things. So in the volume, we do a much better job than I'm doing tonight of unpacking immigration, if you will. And then we wanted to situate these themes within the larger context of immigration and social control, particularly new modes of control in a post-9/11 era. Here we were interested in understanding how the rise of anti-immigration legislation was co-occurring with policies related to the war on terror. Where are the connections that we can identify in that? Now, literally the month that this book came out, I got the following email with the subject line, "Immigration makes California stronger, nonsense," which brings me full circle to when I had started my investigation 10 years ago. So here's what I got. And notice I didn't even get a "Dear Professor Kubrin." At least Rob Samson got "Dear Professor Samson." I just got, "You and your research team reach the conclusions you wish to reach, not based on evidence or findings, but based on your radical left-wing politics. To pretend that there are no costs of policing our Mexican border, delivering the babies of illegal immigrants, educating them, incarcerating illegals who commit a disproportionately high number of crimes is the height of dishonesty, the height of it. But then again, you educators are the ones who have long clamored for more money for education under the false pretense that it will make things better. In fact, what you have done is dumb down education to such an extent that tens of millions of kids now attend college who are not qualified to do so. You should all be ashamed of yourselves for your dishonesty, but you are not." Right, I've been working on this for 10 years. The literature is clear as day. The numbers and data are speaking for themselves. Why does this immigration and crime narrative persist? So a while ago, I was working on the conclusion for this talk, sort of thinking about how I wanted to wind things up and what thoughts I wanted to leave you all with. And I was going to do what I usually do in these typical kind of talks, is summarize the findings, make sure you agree with them, right? Hit you over the head with them, make sure you tell everyone you know about them. And I happened to be talking to a girlfriend of mine, and I was going on and on about these emails and how public perception is so off and how frustrating it is. And I showed her the email that Samson got and the one that I got. And at one point, she pointed to the email that Rob Samson got, and she asked me, like, very calmly, "Could there be a shred of validity to what this guy has written?" And I remember thinking, what? Are you kidding? A shred of validity? This guy's racist, this and that. And then I stopped and realized that question stung a little bit, because I had never, not even once, stopped to ask myself that question. Could there be a shred of validity to what he has written? And then for the first time, I actually noticed something I had never noticed before. This guy lives in Phoenix, Arizona. And then I remembered what was happening in Phoenix, Arizona at the time that he wrote this email. So many of you may or may not be aware that during the 1990s, the United States spent a ton of money to beef up the US-Mexico border, primarily around the states of California and Texas. We put in stadium lighting, motion sensor detectors, we militarized the border, we had a series of operations, all of which served to plug up the border in California and Texas. Of course, people that are coming to the United States, the push factors that send people here, war, famine, unable to make a living, unable to support one's family, are much bigger than any kind of barrier that we can create. That is the force of the push that sends many people to the United States. So those folks are going to find a different way to come to the United States, and they did. And that was primarily through the state of Arizona. Now, what this meant was that cities all throughout Arizona, Phoenix included, were changing literally overnight in terms of their demographic profiles. And you can imagine what it's like to be in a city, in a neighborhood that has looked one way for so long that is changing drastically. That produces a lot of fear for people. And then I realized, I had never thought about that. That provides, not that I agree with him, but that provides a little bit of context. Then that started me down the rabbit hole of just how I had been doing my research and who I had been presenting it to. Basically, I was doing the research, publishing it in the best journals, and then talking to people who basically agreed with my point of view, who basically were in my echo chamber, mostly other academics, who understood what I was saying and agreed with me. And then I started to wonder, well, maybe I've been doing things very one-sided and wrong. And so I decided to put that to the test. And I did that by agreeing recently to go on to a radio talk show, conservative radio talk show on KFI AM 640 called The John and Ken Show. And they wanted me on, they contacted me to talk not about immigration and crime, but about a recent study I had published on Prop 47 and crime. And just very quickly, Prop 47 is a recent criminal justice reform that identifies the lowest level nonviolent petty theft offenders, drug offenders, charges them as misdemeanors rather than felonies, so that instead of going up to state prison at the tune of $75,000 a year per individual, they're kept and housed locally at a much lower cost. The savings from Prop 47 would be reinvested into preventing crime. And so I had published this study on the impact of Prop 47 on crime. And they wanted to talk to me about it, John and Ken. And when the producer called to ask me to be on the show, I said, I have one condition, and that is that we do the show live. And the producer said, great, I'll call you in an hour. Now, has anyone heard of John and Ken? Okay, a few people. I had no idea who they were until I was asked to be on there. But I quickly learned. So they do a style of what I would call political infotainment. They're conservative, okay? Political infotainment. I think their Twitter handle summarizes it all. Their Twitter handle says, kicking ass and taking names, which they say they do 5 days a week. Now, along with the Los Angeles Association of Deputy District Attorneys, John and Ken were sponsoring an initiative to roll back Prop 47 and other criminal justice reforms in the state, claiming that they were responsible for rising crime rates in California. My study showed no impact, so they wanted to have me on. And so I knew this wasn't going to be a walk in the park, especially if you've heard them before and know their show, but I had my sights set on something bigger. I wanted to stress test the way that I presented my research outside of the confines of academia. I wanted to talk to people who I knew weren't going to agree with me, who were going to push back and push back hard. So in the hour that I had before I went live, I got busy reading my paper over and over again, taking my notes, preparing my talking points, and I was ready to answer any question they had for me. And we went live. And right out the starting gate, they asked me a completely loaded question about my study methodology, to which I responded carefully and thoroughly. There was a long pause, and then the interview went completely off the rails. I encourage you to listen to it if you want to know what I'm talking about. For the next 30 minutes, it was a one-sided argument to which I did not participate. I was screamed at, yelled at, cut off. I was called names. They called me a snowflake. And then they also accused me of falsifying data and making up my data to support my political position. Now, all through this interview, I had to remind myself to breathe and to take the questions as they came, answer the ones that I could, push back when I felt I needed to, and hope that one of their 1.2 million listeners, yes, they have 1.2 million listeners, would get something out of my interview. So 30 minutes in, the duo went on a screaming tirade, circling back to my political agenda, to which I responded something like, I have nothing to say to that. It's absolutely ludicrous. And then either they or their producer slammed on the phone on me. And I remember being in my office, because I was on my office phone, like shaking after that interview. I think I called my husband, and I was shaking, because I've never experienced something like that. I started replaying the interview over and over and over in my mind. And then something weird happened. Like two or 3 minutes after that, I actually started laughing. Do you ever have those moments where you just I started laughing. I mean, I survived the interview, and I actually thought I did okay. I made the points I wanted to make. I stayed calm. But the most unexpected gift of all came maybe an hour after the interview aired. I got emails, dozens of them, from supportive listeners who first of all wanted to apologize on behalf of John and Ken, as if like John and Ken were their uncle that had misbehaved badly at Thanksgiving dinner, okay? But secondly, and more importantly, that despite the talk show craziness, they actually got something out of the study, that they learned something from what I had to say. I mean, was that experience uncomfortable? Yes. But did I grow? Absolutely. The motto of the UCI School of Social Ecology is science driving solutions. Through research, teaching, and community engagement, the School of Social Ecology focuses on science-based solutions to social and environmental problems. Now, up until then, I thought I had done a pretty good job in terms of my research and teaching. But in terms of my community engagement, I kind of had largely failed. I was mainly spending my time talking to other academics and people that generally agreed with my point, and then getting frustrated when we weren't making any headway. And then I had a major epiphany as I thought about this. All along, I had been speaking to the proverbial choir, right? And I decided right then and there, my approach to the narrative had to change. So then I started thinking, well, what did I learn from stress testing the way I present my research outside of the confines of academia, outside of my echo chamber? Well, the first thing I learned was mom and dad were right. Sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. When we take criticism personally, even when it's directed at us, we lose. I lose, because I make it about me and not the research. But the research really is the star in all of this. In fact, the research is my North Star, guiding me along the way when I feel lost. I also realized I need to be better at strengthening my communication muscle so that I can talk with people who don't always agree with what I have to say, or even agree with the idea that research should guide policy. I'm not here to convert anybody, or better yet, prove how wrong you are and how right I am. But I am here to be the messenger of the research and let the research speak for itself. And if I've learned anything about this journey, it's that in order to grow as an academic and as a person, we have to push ourselves in big and small ways every single day. This was a real wake-up call from the largely insular life that I was leading as an academic. Now, it's no surprise that we suffer from big communication problems in this country, especially when it comes to the topic of immigration and crime. But up until this point, I hadn't really questioned what role I may be playing in all of this. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm still trying to figure out what it means to present outside the confines of academia and present my results in a new, important way, but I have realized that it's time for me to own my part in all of this, and in my own quiet ways to extend an olive branch. Because at least when my head hits the pillow at night, I'll know in my heart that I cared enough about the research and humanity to try and make that happen. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for
Thank
questions.
you, Charis. Can
Yes.
you take questions?
I'd love to take questions.
Okay,
I'm gonna grab some water.
who's going to take our, She's going to take the mic around.
Here.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your work. I happen to be a social psychologist, so I'm particularly interested in what you're doing. I think the challenge is that the people who don't believe your findings are tied into a belief system that is pretty much immune to facts. And it's very valuable that you're doing the research, because the people that do believe in facts and do believe that policy should be based on information have that. But it's very difficult. Some of those people are feeling powerless, and that's one thing to recognize. And by not believing it, they're tied into a tribe that has a whole network of beliefs that are you know, the reason they, in the radio show that you were accused of all these things, of having an agenda and so on, is because that's the whole network of the belief system. Have you had other exposures to presenting this to the public where you've gotten similar kinds of reactions?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've presented at our Rotary Club. I've presented to the Conservative Student Union at UCI. I mean, my new goal is to accept any invitation, regardless of where it's coming from, in an effort to provide that information, and then to not get so invested when people don't do exactly what I want them to do with that information. Because what that does to me is that I realize in academia, we're not so great about connecting with people. We're really good about saying, here's our research, learn it, live it, love it kind of thing. And the reality is that people make decisions, as you just noted, based on a variety of factors, maybe none of which have to do with what the research says. I've had people tell me, I don't care what the research says, this is how I feel. So being that detached, unemotional, objective researcher is important for the research itself, but that doesn't mean that that's how I need to treat how I interact with people to talk about it. So part of it is that I'm open now to opportunities to be able to discuss this, and I'm not going to worry how many people I've converted or turned over. The surprise gift about John and Ken was the emails that followed. And so what that suggests to me is that people are way more complex. I mean, I might have written them off. You watch John and Ken, I have no interest in speaking with you because you have this belief system. And what I've realized is that it's easy to dismiss and categorize, and in fact, people are much more nuanced in that respect. And so that's something that I'm trying to be better about. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and it doesn't mean I have all the solutions, and it doesn't mean I'm going to let go of the facts and paint things otherwise, but it means I'm going to rethink how I'm out there doing it, because what I've been doing for 15 years hasn't really had, and not just me, but the whole field. I mean, we don't need another study at this point on the immigration and crime question, right? So something's got to give on that.
Okay, is the possibility of non-reporting in these immigrant from over here?
Oh, there. Sorry, I'm going. Where is the coming from?
Possibility of non-reporting, because I understand from things that I've read that some crime is not reported because they're afraid of the police. Is that factored into your studies?
Great question. So I can tell you about all of the studies that look at documented status. It turns out that we have surveys that look at documented status that ask people to report their reporting behavior as well as their crime and victimization. And we can triangulate those data sources with official data sources collected by police and, you know, deposited to the FBI, which is what most of us use. They're very consistent in showing that it's not an issue of simply underreporting. In fact, what we know is that when asked on self-report surveys where information is completely kept confidential, there is the reporting is happening. So what we know is that does not explain away that finding, although that's a common theory that you hear out there. The light piece that I shared from you with criminology, that piece also addresses that issue in their analysis. Thanks. Yes?
Okay. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was a great lecture. But I want to go back to what you learned from the people who talked to you. You said you grew, but remember, that was the New York Times article that was up there. And overwhelmingly, that was a negative response. And I'm not sure I can agree that these are people who hate facts or don't have anything. This is real experience that people have come across in their own lives. This is their world of perhaps violence and criminology by people of color, perhaps. And that really can't be ignored. It can't be written out. And what did you learn from people who had experiences like that?
Right. So, I mean, the idea is that you have to take those experiences as a form of data, and you have to take them into account. That doesn't mean that those experiences should inform policy. So my concern is that we've all had experiences of all different kinds. They're valid experiences. They're important experiences. They shape our outlook on things, but they do not necessarily a good policy make. And so, you know, this happens with Prop 47. I'll speak with police officers and they'll say, well, I see in my own jurisdiction this is happening. And I'm not denying that it's not happening. I'm not denying them their experiences, but I'm saying, okay, that's one piece of the puzzle. What does the rest of the pieces coming together say about what that puzzle tells us about Prop 47's impact? So for me, it's, I think, being more sensitive to those stories, hearing about them, interjecting some nuance in ways that I hadn't thought about before, but I'm not prepared to start building policy on anything other than what the actual findings of studies have to say. So that's where I'm drawing the line personally. Yeah. And by the way, I mean, a lot of these studies don't know how they're going to turn out. I mean, I'm engaged in a study right now looking at the effect of California becoming a sanctuary state on crime, because this is a big concern. People are saying, oh, California became a sanctuary state. That means we're harboring undocumented individuals, letting them commit crimes. We should see an increase in crime. Well, now I'm testing that hypothesis. So as someone who is working a lot in this area, I have to be as objective as possible as I can when I do these studies, okay? But I also don't know exactly what the data are going to say, so I have to be prepared for anything. I have to defend the study is what I have to do, not the I have to defend the methodology of the study. And every study I've done, I feel like I can defend that methodology.
Next question is right here. And if you're wondering, I'm trying to do a question from a man and then a question from a woman. And I'm trying, if I'm not just doing people that are in the same area. Thank you.
I can't help but wonder if there isn't another factor in this. We're talking here about pretty much first generation people coming into this country. And I wonder if we follow through to second and third generation when they become more westernized, if you will, because it seems to me that in the older cultures, etc., they have much more control and influence over their children. And as time goes along, I think unfortunately, this is a sad commentary on our westernized society.
You are 100% correct. So if I had like you for 3 hours tonight, I'd go through all the findings of my NAS report. But one of the findings that I come across based on the literature is that immigrants that have resided in the US longer, okay, and the children of immigrants and those who are more assimilated begin to look more like the native born in terms of their offending levels. Now, they do not approach the native born. Native born always wins on that one, but they are moving in that direction. And that has caused researchers to talk about the Americanization process in terms of what's going on, as well as a famous researcher talks about it, not the immigrant, but their children problem. So that is a new area of study, which people are investigating the mechanisms by which the children of immigrants and people that reside in the US longer begin to look more like native-born individuals. In the studies that we did in our meta-analysis, what we found, studies that allowed for multiple generations, what we found is that on average, that relationship between immigration and crime moved towards zero. It became less strongly negative. So it's not that it's a strong positive relationship, meaning second generation assimilated folks are engaging in crime. It means the protective benefits of being an immigrant or living in an immigrant community lessen for that group. And answering the question of why is the next big research push in that area. Great point.
Hi, I'm a sociologist of immigration.
Woohoo!
So you did a great job. I hope everybody gets really interested in our immigrants. Among other things, they're also healthier than native-born. I have a question about the mechanisms behind your findings, assuming that the relationship is negative. I'm a little disappointed about the no effect results. You didn't show us all the possibly quantitative equations that stand behind what you've done.
Right.
But I'm wondering, is the effect only one that immigrants come, they're more traditional, as the gentleman said, there's more family control, the intact family is greater, so there's less crime, there's more social control? Is that the whole effect? Or is there also some diffusion? That is to say, have you looked at all at what the effect of an immigrant population or immigrant neighborhood is on those who are geographically proximate to the immigrants?
Great question. So we have lots of theories, as I mentioned in my talk, explaining that. What we don't have is data to test the theories. Now, I recently got funding from the National Science Foundation to do just that. And I've been very interested in community-level theories that explain why immigrant communities have lower crime rates. And I've been interested in the enclave hypothesis, which looks at the characteristics of neighborhoods with high concentrations of immigrants in terms of the benefits that are provided to members, like help with jobs, networks, ties, informal social control. We collected data for all of Southern California, measured the rate of businesses and various voluntary organizations in the communities that were run by immigrants and co-ethnics, had no impact. In other words, that did not explain away the immigration-crime relationship. What I am convinced about, and coming to be convinced about more and more, although I haven't tested it, is that it really is a selection argument. What we are talking about here are a group of people, on average, coming to the United States that are the least crime-prone kinds of folks that you can imagine. And I said part of that is due to the reasons that they are migrating. Anyone who leaves their home country, moves to another place, tries to set up a life, get employed, make money, and do better for themselves and their children, has the kinds of qualities that criminals do not possess. And those are things like self-control, motivation, being hardworking, willing to delay gratification. Now, to the extent that that is not driving immigrants to this country, we can start to question that. Like, for example, we know that some immigrants come here involuntarily for other reasons, okay? So we can start looking at differences in motive for migration, whether that's linked to these kinds of propensities, and what impact that has on crime. So it's very difficult to test these theories. Initial stuff suggests that it may have a lot to do with the selection effect of who comes to the US. Yes?
Thank you, Professor. I enjoy your talk. Let me say I consider myself an illegal immigrant because I didn't get permission from Native Americans.
Point taken.
That's my theory.
Yes.
Let me pose a question, or have you done comparative study between Canadian policy, immigration policy with the United States?
Great question. And in fact, I was just at a workshop where we had a guy from Cambridge who says, everything you're describing has nothing to do with what's going on in Europe at the moment. And he thought that everything that the research that has been done in the United States, especially the meta-analysis, needs to be done in outside the United States to be able to get some comparatives. Absolutely agree. So no, all of the research I have personally done has been within the United States. All of the studies that we reviewed, for the meta-analysis, the 50+ studies, were all studies done in the United States. And we partly did that because we wanted to compare apples with apples and not apples with oranges. But the absolute next step of research in this area would be moving on to other places, whether it's Canada, Europe, you name it.
Thank you, and Charis, I would like to introduce your neighbor.
There's Dave.
Our Dave. And running for state senate. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. Appreciate it. No, I don't know. Do we have any more?
Do we have other questions?
Thanks, Dave.
Charis, do you have time for one
Sorry,
more
I thought Dave was going to make a
question,
statement.
Yes?
Sure, absolutely.
We'll take 2 more questions.
Hi, mine is not a question, but a comment, and that is if you want to reach people, perhaps writing
We really want to have
not just in
speak
a
probably
scholarship
sometime next
mode, but popularize what you've learned. Because a lot of times, I think of Gail Sheehy's work that popularized what other people had studied. I think you could get your message out a lot more than going from Rotary Club to Rotary Club. So it's just an idea.
Great idea, and I'm happy to report that I'm absolutely doing that. So I published a piece, I'm not sure if you've heard of The Conversation, published a piece in The Conversation, which is where academics get to write op-eds, basically. And luckily, it was picked up by Scientific American, PBS NewsHour, NBC News, and so I got plenty of hate mail from that as well. But so yes, now I have a new rule, and I get to do this because I'm full professor and tenured, and I don't need to worry about this. I wouldn't encourage my junior colleagues to do this because it's a lot of time and a lot of rejection. But now every time I write a paper, we do a press release at UC Irvine, and there is an accompanying op-ed or opinion piece placed somewhere that is meant to get way out there, way more than the journals. So yes, I completely agree.
I really enjoyed your talk, and having lived in the South during segregation, the only thing that kept many whites who were ignorant and poverty and so forth was their superiority over the black. They still were one step ahead, above black people who were subservient.
Right.
I relate that very strongly to the reaction of immigration. We, as white nationalists, want to keep that superiority, and if there is too much immigration, and especially if the immigration succeeds, then they are losing their control. And it's starting to appear in congressional elections. So where that goes has a lot of digging in by these people who really are threatened in their own eyes by immigration. Immigration, segregation, bigotedness, such as a lady over here mentioned about LGBT, that is where the problem lies. How do we cope and overcome? And therefore, what do you approach this subject of superiority?
Yeah, I treat that as the concept of nativism, sort of, the fear of anything foreign. And I mean, if you look historically, when I teach my immigration course, we talk about periods of nativism in this country. It's always been present. It's just been at different groups, including white ethnics. So for example, for a long time it was against the Polish and the Irish. We had assumptions about them. I mean, you name a historical period and that nativism is there. So, this is like the million-dollar question, which is how do you stop this? How do you stop these feelings? I don't really have great answers for you on that. That's a bigger million-dollar question that I don't know the answer to, but it's something that is very challenging because it's always been with us, and it's something that we have to work hard to fight on a daily basis, and that's one reason why I try and teach the course. My thing is like find young people. So I realize that I'm saying that in this club. But I'm saying, I'm thinking about, getting our young people who are going to go out and be leaders in one way, shape, or form. The students at UCI, they have their whole futures ahead of them. I tell them, look, I'm getting over the hill. It's up to you all to take everything you've learned in this class and do something with it. And I put the guilt trip on them, and I put it on big. And, and I feel like if we can do that enough and get generations of people thinking differently, and not just on this issue, but on a number of different issues, we can begin to move things. I mean, I am optimistic. I'll take something like the death penalty. For the longest time historically, opinion on the death penalty did not budge. I mean, it didn't matter what argument you gave. People felt strongly about having the death penalty. And what we have seen over time, very slow, is an erosion of support for the death penalty. And, we can move the ticker a little bit. It might take a long time, and it might require lots of hard work, but I have faith that there can be movement. And so for me, I want to get the young people with a lot of energy starting that movement. So send your kids and your grandkids to UCI and tell them to take my class. I want to get a hold of them. Okay.
much, Professor. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.